Okay, so let me start by welcoming Ted Bianco to this event. This event is organized by the Oxford Global Health and Care Systems Society. It's a group of students at the University of Oxford, both undergraduate and postgraduate students who are interested in global health and healthcare in general. And we meet to discuss issues, network with each other, and discuss ideas on how to address pressing problems around global health and see what collaborations could come from these while we're together in the University of Oxford. And the committee of the society have initiated this series for a while now, where we have thought leaders invited to speak on contemporary topics that are relevant to their expertise, and have us engage with them, learn from their experience, and who knows, from engaging with them, we could get the next idea that could revolutionize or solve a major problem in global health. So we're happy to have with us today Ted Bianco. You're welcome. As a former director of the Wellcome Trust and has extensive experience in global health around several areas, including the role of pharma. And today he'll be talking to us about the role of pharma in global health. And like you can see projected on the slide, to give him a little more flexibility for the discussion, he'll be talking about industry in general and global health. So we welcome Ted to this talk, and we look forward to having an engaging experience. Please feel free to drop your messages in the chat while the discussion is going on, and I'm sure at the end of the session, Ted will be able to answer questions, or if students, members have any contributions, there'll be options for them to speak as well. So I think Tunde, who's a member of the committee in the society, will all be moderating the session. So I'll hand over to Tunde now, who will usher Ted in to start this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francis. So I think time is fast spent, and just to say thank you once again to Ted for accepting our invitation, and over to you, Ted.
Thank you. Many thanks, Francis. Many thanks, Tunde. It's great to meet you at long last, Tunde, because we've corresponded about this event. And I'd like to congratulate you guys on organizing yourself in this way at the Global Health Society to create a network. And not only while you're having your time at Oxford, but probably for the many years to come. These networks always provide a really important lever when you're trying to get things done in the world. So my background is as a parasitologist. I trained at London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine, and then subsequently worked overseas and in the UK, and ended up at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, where I was the professor of parasitology. But at a subsequent point, I went to the Wellcome Trust, where I had various roles, of which two of the most significant were probably Director of Innovations, where we were funding a lot of translational research, and then as Director of the Trust for a period before Jeremy Farrar came in. And I want to talk really based on that experience of engaging with people in industry over probably, in the area of 15 years, oftentimes with global health as our primary objective in those discussions. I think, I don't really need to tell this audience that health inequity around the world is as dreadful today as it's been for decades, for centuries. And this distorted map of the world showing where the infants die, it is really an outrage, a grotesque image, but an image of sadly what still happens today. Similarly, where the centurions die is also a huge distortion of the global map. And really, this is a reflection, not so much are you going to live to be 100, but really, what's longevity like? And as a general handle on longevity, this indicates there's also a massive inequity in terms of general longevity, let alone survival through infanthood. There's much talk about trickle-down effects, and trickle-down economics has probably had a bad name for quite a long time. Trickle-down economics, as I'm sure you're aware, is this concept that if the wealthy get wealthy, it will trickle down because they'll create employment and opportunities for everyone in their society, and everyone will benefit from it over a period of time. The reality of this graph, based on US data, but probably true of many places, is that the wealthy get wealthier, and some of the middle class, if you like, do get some relief. But actually those in the bottom 50%, this is not the bottom of the bottom, this is the bottom 50%, go nowhere. In fact, they really don't benefit whatsoever. So is healthcare any better? Are medicines developed for the major commercial markets finding their way through the system? Trickle-down medicine sort of does work sometimes, but there are only selected examples. Here are some. Gardasil, which is one of the two, well, now many vaccines for HPV infection in both girls and boys, depending on which vaccine we're talking about, was released and marketed in low-income countries really quite soon after its market introduction in the major world markets. Rotarix and its similar Rotatec, the rotavirus vaccine, similarly were released very soon into the full global markets, because of course rotavirus vaccine is primarily a tool for those people at greatest risk in low income countries, infants in low income countries. And of course, you know that the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine was offered to the world at the very earliest point, thanks to the collaboration between Oxford and AstraZeneca. So these are examples where there was trickle down, and it happened pretty fast. In fact, the price point of these vaccines was also corrected pretty fast. So both Gardasil and Rotarix, their prices were slashed by Merck and by GSK at about a similar time, not that long after its release, 1 or 2 years after their release. But we know that many medicines, we have to wait on the generics. In other words, we have to wait for expiry of the patent before the world sees them. Here's a famous example, atorvastatin, which was marketed as Lipitor by Pfizer, made Pfizer a lot of money. There are other statins, but this is one of the statins that really led the charge in understanding how much benefit is derived from this. So the fact that the world has to wait on most medicines to become generics before they become accessible at affordable prices is a huge issue. So trickle down isn't great, but there are some things that get neglected more than just this waiting on generics. And you know, if we look at the march of progress, 1920 versus 2020, look what happened to the phone. The phone has been revolutionized, and it's no surprise. The aeroplane has been revolutionized. On the left is a biplane. On the right, this is the Virgin's version of a space aircraft. Look at the comparison in medicine for the surgeon. A toolkit like you might find in the garage versus a Da Vinci robot capable of the most precise work. And this, in the bottom of this table, is BCG, the treatment for TB, or the prophylactic treatment for TB, should I say. A vaccine which, since it was trialed in 1919, 1920, has not really been superseded. Just a travesty of neglect. So where do the roles and responsibilities lie for some of the global health issues that I'm sure you are most conscious of, and I too? And I think we know that the United Nations organizations have a huge role to play. The World Health Assembly, the WHO, of course. There are a number of these organizations that transcend governments and have a real responsibility in sort of orchestrating how help is delivered to address these global health challenges. But of course, there's national governments carrying responsibility, private sector, and public research, the kind of research you do in the universities. Civil society can sometimes be the driver to spur on any or all of these actors. But there is a role for philanthropy, and I think this is where I was very conscious of my responsibility when I was working at Wellcome. Because through research into the neglected diseases, there's a huge catalytic effect on research in universities and in public laboratories generally. There is the possibility of stimulating action in the private sector, and I'm going to talk about some of that. And these can be a stimulatory effect, but I really urge you not to see them as the answer. I think philanthropies can be catalysts. I don't think they're cures. Philanthropies can also step in at the time when you need to sort of filter down the options. So if the research has been productive and there are multiple options that should be considered in terms of addressing a global health challenge, then those are usually the kinds of triaging that are done within the private sector. And philanthropy can play a role in stimulating the private sector to work through those options. But ultimately, it's national governments. National governments working with the private sector need to deliver ongoing care. And that can be because the private sector is working on a for-profit basis, a not-for-profit basis, or a highly subsidized basis. I sort of want to make clear that although we're talking about how the industry can play a role in global health, as I'm sure you're very conscious, there are so many other issues that stand in the way of good health for the poorest communities. National regulatory agencies are very often absent. National quality control laboratories are very often absent. Controlled substance legislation for narcotics, for example, can really stand in the way of legitimate pain control. Getting morphine in some countries is really blocked by the legislation in spite of the need within medicine for those drugs. Healthcare infrastructure, we know, is a cause of great failure, as is discriminatory practices. And overarching all of this is often a lack of good governance. But I'd add two other issues here, issues that are sometimes not talked about as much. One is purchasing consortia, whereas a wealthy country or a wealthy bloc like the European Union can negotiate over price, and does negotiate over price very hard. And low-income countries can benefit from being seen as in great need and therefore attracting attention from the industry that they either respond to or they do not. Middle-income countries are left in a terrible no man's land. There are too many middle-income countries for big pharmaceutical companies to cut individual deals. Now, a country like Jordan is not going to find it easy to get prime time to cut a deal for a medicine versus, for example, the European Union or North America. So it's extremely difficult, and there are very, very many of these middle-income countries that are sort of left high and dry because they're too small to command the attention of the pharmaceutical companies to negotiate a tiered pricing. And the last in this list, long list, is programmatic interventions research. And what I mean by this is there's a lot of research goes into what kinds of products we might need for an intervention or services we might need for an intervention, but actually monitoring the effectiveness of control programs, of interventions, is often done by the people implementing those activities. And I think you need an independent eye. This is probably at its most acute in emergency medicine, where people rushing in with good intent make interventions that might or might not be the best intervention to make. And they're usually not all that receptive to having a lot of researchers going around with clipboards while they're trying to save the day over some emergency. But do we know whether the interventions are the best they need and should be? I think you only get to that by independent intervention research. This is a slide I'm sure very familiar to you, the patterns of mortality in low and high income countries. And I mean, there's a lot of detail here, but if we just focus in on what's blue and what's green, it's pretty obvious that it's really a feature of low income country health on the right-hand panel to be associated with communicable disease, and high income countries to be primarily beset by non-communicable disease. If we were to look at the solid dots and the open circles there, you can see that the picture is on the right-hand panel for low-income countries. It's improving somewhat. It's improved pretty well for HIV, diarrheal disease, less so for neonatal conditions, lower respiratory infections. But the picture is a slow rate of burn, a slow rate of improvement. And in the meantime, non-communicable diseases are sneaking into that top 10 list, even in the low-income countries. If we looked at middle-income countries, essentially it's a mix of the two. So what we have is a really difficult situation in which the communicable diseases haven't really been conquered, but the non-communicable diseases are now beginning to show up. And this is without introducing the complexity of a pandemic like COVID, which of course introduces a lot of communicable disease across the piece. So we have something that is really demanding from a global health point of view to address. And in my career, I was an undergraduate in King's College London in 1970. And if I go back to 1970 through to 2020, there have been many initiatives aimed at attacking what we would call the neglected tropical diseases, which is really, I consider, just a subset of those diseases in global health that we should be concerned with. But it's an important subset that's often given a great deal of attention because of its neglect and because of the importance of communicable disease. But in the 1970s, WHO, which had a lot of money at the time, had started a special program for research and development of tropical diseases. Rockefeller Foundation was an important foundation at that time with a lot of money and was working on the great neglected diseases of mankind, so-called, and smaller charities like the Edmund Connell Clark Foundation were picking on certain subjects to address. Then we know in the 2000s, the Melinda Gates Foundation became very significant. Probably had Wellcome in there as a significant player, of course. Public-private partnerships started picking up in terms of their agenda and the numbers of different PDPs that were working in neglected diseases. And we had the London Declaration on neglected tropical diseases in 2012. What you see in 2020, so now as we approach the current day, is that there's a lot of convergence of some of these activities. So the World Health Assembly, WHO's roadmap, really relates closely to what the Kigali Declaration on Neglected Tropical Diseases from just last month is addressing. So they converge, as is the NTD NGO network. So what you have there is really a consolidation of some of the activities, certainly a coordination of some of those activities in a really helpful way, while the philanthropies and the PDPs continue with their work and continue to contribute to those overall coordinated efforts. So I think that the pattern is useful, but the problem isn't going away fast. If we think about companies, companies certainly find it easier to work in what we class as pre-competitive space. And in my time at Wellcome, this sort of learning together in basic science in pre-competitive space that companies did has some really notable and greatly successful examples. One, the Kinase Consortium, which was run out of Dundee University, was looking at the biology of kinases at a time that nobody really thought kinases would make good drug targets. They thought there's too many of them, they all overlap in function, you could get no specificity. Turned out not to be true, although it was a tricky art, a tricky thing to pull off, but the companies got together to learn together about kinases working with University of Dundee researchers. SNPs, small nucleotide polymorphisms, and structural genomics, they attracted consortia of companies also. These were all sort of pre-competitive, easy to share information without feeling you were jeopardizing your proprietary position. It's harder when it comes to working with your R&D or your product departments from a company perspective. You're revealing more of your internal portfolio, of your pipeline and your commercial position. So it often needs the orchestration by a body to manage that effectively, which is why PDPs have worked so well in drawing companies in, where the company only needs to reveal what it's working on in relation to that PDP's objectives. So for example, with Medicines for Malaria venture, GSK, when it engages through primarily its Tres Cantos group, describing the work that they're doing on compounds directly related to malaria. And some of the collective efforts like the London Declaration are really designed to attract donors, attract governments to pay attention to those companies that are contributing to global health objectives. The last there I have on that list, filarial disease control, is much more specific, but the Global Programme for Elimination of Lymphatic Filariasis, there are now several companies contributing drugs to that effort. And the African Programme of OGHCS control is a good example of where a company came in to make a contribution to change the character of OGHCS control in Africa very dramatically. An example I'm going to come back to in a minute. When it comes to how industries engage, they engage in a variety of ways. Donation is clearly in a well-known, it's quite a famous example. I think we're all aware that there have been some quite important donations of drugs or vaccines. But no profit, no loss is also a significant way. That's how AstraZeneca, for example, are wanting to approach distribution of their COVID vaccine during the period of the pandemic. Subsidized pricing, that is a way that, for example, the vaccine that was produced by the Serum Institute of India for one of the, blocking now, one of their vaccines that Gates funded, that I will remember shortly, it was an agreed introductory price of 40 cents a dose for, I think, the first 200 million doses, certainly a very large number of doses. And that it was a very good example of subsidized pricing, although I think it's always difficult to set a price many years before you have a product to distribute. And there are tiered pricing packages and low-cost, high-volume sales. Low-cost, high-volume sales, say, from some of the major manufacturers in India. There's diversity, though, in how different sectors of the industry are prepared to make their contributions. So in the pharmaceutical industry, there's certainly very good examples of project donation, no profit, no loss sales, tiered pricing, subsidized R&D. In engineering, it's not generally the same style. There's certainly royalty-free licenses, open source software, and subsidized R&D. They make in-kind contributions of expertise, but it's rarer to see big donations of product. It's not strictly true that this never happens. DuPont donated a great deal of monofilament mesh for the control of guinea worm at one time, for example, but it's not the general way. And with agrochemicals, the agrochemical industry essentially is prepared to do contract R&D and offer advice, but it generally doesn't make large product donations. The donation that set the bar is for of ivermectin. When I was beginning my PhD in 1974, Cassius Clay, became Muhammad Ali, of course, and George Foreman were having a Kinshasa battle of all battles. It was called Rumble in the Jungle and attracted a huge amount of attention. But on the west side of the continent, there was something much more important happening, and that was the instigation of onchocerciasis control using an insecticide abate to spray the rivers and kill the larval stages of the major black fly vectors. It wasn't a plan that was going to be sustainable in perpetuity. And the reason for that is because it was an extremely expensive campaign, and you were putting into the rivers things that were going to be causing ecological damage. They used quite carefully insecticides to minimize that damage, but nobody would choose to deposit insecticide into rivers in the really long term. So this was a program designed to go on for 20 years until the parasite population died out in the human population. And what they desperately needed was a drug to consolidate this program. And the drug that came along in the end was a drug from Merck, which was ivermectin. And ivermectin derived from a soil bacterium, Streptomyces, discovered by a remarkable Japanese scientist, Satoshi Omura, and he worked with a colleague in Merck called Bill Campbell. They never met in the period that all this research happened. They only met some years later, and this is them sitting together to receive the Nobel Prize, for goodness sake. But actually they dealt with each other by phone. It was a remarkable bit of history. And it turned out ivermectin was a pretty wonderful drug, and it made a fantastic veterinary product for killing worms and ectoparasites, all sorts of things. But it's what happened later, that this drug donation, that really tipped the scales on the importance of ivermectin. Because on October 21, 1987, the guy in the middle of the lower panel, who's smiling away there with that's Jimmy Carter on his left, but the guy in the middle smiling away is the CEO and chairman of Merck at the time, a guy called Roy Vagelos. And this was a man of some real stature. He had a vision, and he was prepared to make a huge, bold statement, and that was to donate ivermectin for the treatment of onchocerciasis in a program of huge scale. So the map of onchocerciasis control in this map of Africa is described in yellow. That's the map of onchocerciasis control by the elimination of black flies. The African program of onchocerciasis control, mediated using ivermectin, is what's shown in orange. And it extended the program, including the area in yellow, of course. There was treatment within the OCP area, but then across the continent. So this really set a bar. It was a donation of a drug free of charge in perpetuity. And when I spoke to colleagues at Merck, and I know Merck people pretty well, they had a very specific list of why this happened. They knew the tremendous potential of the drug. The timing was right. The onchocerciasis control program needed an exit. There was a control program on which to build. They weren't going to have to invent something. They were geared up to manage this infection. It was a big political commitment. And there was a lot at stake now not to lose the gains that had been made since 1974. And then they wanted to control this process. So there was managed implementation, and there was strong governance over the procurement of Mectazan, as it was called. The human formulation was called Mectazan. You couldn't just roll up and ask for a drum of this stuff. You had to go through a process and report how you were going on. I want to spend a bit of time telling you about my experience at Wellcome. Because at Wellcome, we decided we wanted to try, through the subsidizing of the R&D stage, so before companies had products, by subsidizing at the R&D stage, how much more leverage could you get on global health challenges? We needed industry know-how to engage with Wellcome. So although Wellcome was working with a lot of public laboratories, a lot of universities, we needed that industry know-how as well in the R&D process in order to generate products. And we needed a tool to strengthen the case for a scientist within a company to go along to his manager and say, we should take an award from Wellcome and do this job in global health. Because the reality is, within R&D departments in big companies, scientists have to bid for attention. They have dozens of ideas of potential products, and only a small number of those ideas are going to rise to the top of the heap. Most of them will have commercial objectives. If you want to make a case for something that's going to have low or no commercial payoff, then you're going to have to work pretty hard to get attention within the company. And it helps enormously if an outside agency has reviewed your scientific proposal and rated it highly, and then is prepared to back that with a check. And we wanted to have a respectful relationship with the businesses. We didn't want to have a dependent relationship with businesses if we were going to try and make demands on them to produce outcomes that were going to benefit global health. And quite frankly, we wanted to encourage more of a relationship between the academic sector and the business sectors so that there would be mutual learning. How did we do this? Well, I'll tell you, although you'll hear a lot of bad things and jokes said about lawyers, in fact, it's within my team, the legal team, that the answers came. We needed to have a way to convince the Charity Commission that by giving companies money, we were addressing the Wellcome Trust's charitable mission. So we used a tool called program-related investments, in which we balanced the contribution we made to the company with the benefit we were going to get back, either as a charity in terms of sharing any profit if there was profit, or in benefits in terms of addressing our purpose, which was very much, of course, driven by global health objectives. We need to have an institutional policy. So our governing board would have a mechanism to make sure what we were doing on the ground was within the Wellcome Trust's purpose and mission. And we needed the Charity Commission to give a blessing to our route of travel, our direction of travel. It's often called gap funding. This funding where you take a basic idea and then translate it into something that can be used in a practical sense. And here are 4 bridging gaps. In the top left, the small, short, defined gap. Doesn't happen very often when you're trying to gap fund in global health. Usually the gaps are more like the bottom left panel. They're long, and if you're lucky, they're still relatively well defined. The top right-hand picture shows an unusual bridge from China. And this bridge has got a high road and a low road, if you notice. The high road, if you like to say, the high risk, high reward route, is something that's often very attractive to academic researchers because you get recognition for being highly inventive. But of course, the chances of success go down remarkably if you take a brand new route. If you take the low road, let's say creating greater thermostability in an existing product, which simply can't be used well because it has a short shelf life or it doesn't tolerate ambient temperatures, so on and so forth. If you make an adaptation of a product, if you like, it's a much lower risk approach, and it's often a lower reward, although not necessarily that low. Those are important projects to consider. Do you take the high road where you really need high levels of innovation and just have to take the risk? Or do you take the low road where you can get into action, much more likely to get into action in global health, even if it doesn't sound as exciting as a program of research? And then the bottom picture there, the drawbridge there, if you're really lucky, you can strike a deal in which those with an idea are going to be met halfway by an industry that is ready to engage with agreed terms in how that idea can be realized as a product for global health. So, you know, the summary of this is you have some basic research, use gap funding to translate that, and you have a health product. Yeah, well, sounds pretty straightforward when it's nothing like. So really, in a way, the starting point should be to understand the health need and the market demand, to really understand the health need and market demand. Because often that is really misunderstood or comes with a lot of assumptions which might or might not be well founded. Then, in terms of bridging the gap, it's often necessary to establish a technical proof of concept, a clinical proof of concept, but also a target product profile, a TPP. In other words, what am I making here? I need to know in advance of this endeavor exactly what it is I intend to produce. Because in that way, you can look at the competitive landscape and know how is what I'm going to create stacking up against what already exists or what is coming along the pipe. And then you need analytics, because if you make a product, you've got to be able to assess, is this in manufacture? Is this the product it should be? What level of purity, what level of contaminants, and so forth. And then there's all of the stuff that follows: demand forecasts, manufacturability, regulatory approval, procurement processes to go through, and distribution. All of those things are what you need from your company collaboration. Well, so when we were at, when I was at Wellcome as director of innovations, over a 10-year period where we started pretty much from scratch, 2002, 2003, and worked up through 2013. Made 300 awards, spent £500 million, and attracted 1.2 billion in follow-on money. So this is money other people from the industry or from investors put on the table because of the funding Wellcome had done and the research that had driven. So that's the sort of indication of what's involved here. It's not easy. And what's startling is just what part biomedicine plays in this. The average applicant was not from biomedicine. The average applicants were from engineering, from maths and physics, computing, and chemistry, all sorts of subjects. And biomedicine was very important. A third of the people that were, a third of the applicants were from biomedicine. But it much, much broader than that, because this involves multidisciplinary approaches. Needs significant business input, and I'm not even acknowledging the amount of business input in that pie chart, but a lot of business input necessary. And a go, no go approach. You really have to know that you're going to can a program if it's not delivering. The willingness to kill a program that isn't delivering is very important in this sort of translational research. So I'm not going to go through loads of examples. I don't think it's helpful. I'm going to give you just 2 or 3 examples of the kinds of things we funded. This is a company-led partnership. So the Novartis Institute of Tropical Diseases, which was on the Biopolis site in Singapore in 2006, was a group we funded to work on new antimalarials. And the team leader is a guy called Alex Matter, who made his name in cancer research and in cancer therapeutics. In fact, Alex Matter is a very big figure in the world of cancer therapeutics. But he had no background in malaria. Therefore, he had no pet projects, no pet targets. He had that sort of benefit of being an outsider, you know, the objectivity an outsider brings. And he had a great internal network within Novartis Pharma in Switzerland. So he was stuck out in Singapore, but he had enormous contacts within Switzerland. And he had singular purpose. You know, Alex Matter is a very driven guy. He said to me when we funded him, "Thanks for holding my hand through this application process." He'd never had to apply for a grant before, and it was totally foreign to him. He, in fact, often had fights with people in malaria as to whether he was doing the right thing. But he worked with colleagues in academia very successfully, with the Swiss Tropical Institute, the Genomics Institute of Novartis Research Foundation in La Jolla, with the Primate Center, with lots in Holland, with lots of groups. And we had joint funding, just as he had a consortium of researchers. He delivered 2 brand new compounds, which are currently in phase 2 clinical development, going by the attractive names of KAF609 and KAF157. You'll see their progress if you look on the Medicines for Malaria Venture website. To develop 2 brand new pharmacophores that look like they could go all the way in the treatment of malaria is pretty remarkable from one program of this kind. Here's a partnership that's led the other way. It was really led from the academic applicant side. Brian Charleston, your very own Brian Charleston from Pirbright, Institute of Animal Health, and Dave Stewart, the structural biologist from Oxford, were part of the team that really led the charge on this, with colleagues from the US, Homeland Security, with colleagues from South Africa on the spot, with the Merck people from animal health sort of in the background. And they had a suite of tools. They were going to use structure-activity relationships to get a handle on what could they do to improve on a foot and mouth vaccine by manipulating the virus, by manipulating its structure to make capsids more stable, to make epitopes more available, to really produce a virus that could also be replicated in culture faster, because that's a very important economic factor. And they were successful too. They were successful, moreover, in getting Merck Animal Health to want to adopt this technology by the time they had done their work on the virus. And although it isn't commercially available yet, I've every hope that there will be new and improved foot and mouth vaccines emanating from this collaboration. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples that really are a reason to pause for thought. I'm calling it odd couples. On the left, schizophrenia. So I'm using Van Gogh here to illustrate, to be the patient. But in fact, this is a collaboration between what was a retired psychiatrist at the time he was given this award, Julian Leff, who had a concept that he'd wanted to push for many years. And it was the concept that schizophrenia is a condition that might be improved if people could visualize the persecutory voices that are giving them so much trouble. So he worked with the gaming industry to develop avatars that were created to put flesh on the bones, if you like, of what people with schizophrenia believed were the figures behind their persecutory voices. And this was used in a therapeutic context so that they could talk back, if you like, to their tormentors. This was led from the Institute of Psychiatry, and it's had remarkable outcomes. But would you have put gaming and schizophrenia together as a natural couple? I'm not sure. The second example on the right there is the motorsport industry in the form of McLaren and neonatal ICU in the form of the intensivists at Birmingham Hospital. They came together because on a modern car in Formula One, there are hundreds of sensors collecting data. And because you can only collect data during races, the amount you can do outside of a race is very limited under F1 rules. You have to learn in real time how the car is performing and decide what modifications you make in the next race in 2 weeks' time. For example, McLaren has 300 engineers working on new ideas every week, of which a very tiny number might be incorporated into modifications of the car at the next race. And they get that information on which they base their new designs from sensors in that car. And it's very similar to the problem they have in a neonatal ICU. A baby in neonatal ICU is an individual. Their heartbeat can vary enormously according to that individual. Every feature of their physiology is pretty much unique to that individual. So you've got to basically monitor that individual and then look for change. And they do that, of course, with sensors. You very quickly lose a race in Formula One if you don't know my car will be in trouble in the next lap. You actually need to be able to anticipate with patterns from the sensor data. My car will be in trouble in the next lap or the next 3 laps. Let's get into the pits and deal with it. And it's very like that in ICU. You've got to get ahead of the game with a preterm baby about to go down the path. You lose very, very quickly in ICU if you can't anticipate a problem. So we put these guys together to work on algorithms to look at patterns in preterm babies to anticipate trouble. Another remarkable example of an odd couple. I'm going to talk a little bit about one particular area that we pushed at Wellcome, which was about mapping antibiotic use and trying to get new drugs. I don't really need to labor this point on the slide in front of you now, which is that there's a massive threat. This is the new neglected disease. There's lots of antibiotics, but nobody is really able to address with the urgency required where the new antibiotics are going to come from. And this is a worldwide problem which is not going away fast. The reason there aren't antibiotics coming through the pipeline is many and varied. One of them is that since 2000, small molecule screening has really taken over in drug discovery research and hasn't been very effective at yielding new antibiotics. They mainly come from natural compounds. Admitox is another issue. That is to say, getting the pharmacology right, you get the drug to the tissue you need it at, and without off-target effects, with low toxicity, is very demanding, particularly as so many of the existing antibiotics are pretty good in that respect. There's competition from cheap generics because many of these are old drugs being produced very cheaply now. And there's tiered formulary. That is to say, if you do have a new drug, it's going to be put in reserve for the most urgent cases for which all the other drugs have failed. So that means you won't have high volumes of sale, which means you have to recoup your research costs through high unit price. So at Wellcome, we decided we'd give a bit of a push on this. And if you just look at the top 2 lines there, we funded a total of 43 projects, £130 million, pushing on this door of, let's see if we can't rustle out some new antibiotics. And there were some successes. I'm going to just show you this one. A company called OGHCS, which was on the west coast of the US, was very bold in its assertion that it could recondition an old antibiotic, an aminoglycoside. So its plan was to take a sort of strategy which reduced the development cost, to reduce the risk by taking an old drug for which there was a lot of drug resistance, and then change the chemistry to get around that drug resistance. And if you like, create an antibiotic now with the potential to kill bugs that previously it had been unable to kill. And this was a very successful plan. They produced something that they call plasmamycin. It was based on an old aminoglycoside. It had lower tox than the original aminoglycoside from which they derived this. It was indicated for complex urinary tract infections. It got approval from the FDA in 2018. This is a success, right? Well, no, because unfortunately, this rather detailed slide, if you drop down to that bag of money on the left-hand column, they only sold less than £1 million worth of drug in the first year of sales. It was a few $1,000s a treatment, and it was indicated for something that the doctor would only call for when they'd run out of all other options, complicated urinary tract infections. So the company went bust. I mean, these companies go bust very quickly if they aren't able to achieve sales. The company went bust, and the drug was very nearly lost to the world. And on the right, you can see why that happens, because essentially antibiotics are unprofitable drugs to sell. It's a category of drug that's simply unprofitable to sell. You might be relieved to know that there was a fire sale of this drug, and it was picked up by Cipla and is now marketed by Cipla, a drug company in India that produces and sells it. So it wasn't a complete loss, but it's no stimulus to a biotech company when you can't keep yourself afloat by taking on this particular market sector. So let me just turn to that pricing paradox. In public markets, so for example, if you're selling your vaccine to Gavi for use by, let's say, UNICEF or one of the other agencies to vaccinate large populations of children, usually lowest price wins. It's very difficult to believe you can get through that procurement process if you aren't lowest price or very close to it. And if you claim you've got great advantages, you know, but my vaccine does this and my vaccine does that, you're going to have to work pretty hard to get over that hurdle. It's much lauded that people think that they've got advantages. Beating price in public markets, really tough. Private markets, it's rather different. You can have a price that's simply too high. That's what happened to plasmamycin as an antibiotic from Archaeogen. But you can have a price that's too low because there is a perception that the lowest price might mean it's an inferior product. You know, most people don't like to buy the cheapest, and that even includes poor people when they're buying medicines. They might not want the cheapest. They might want something they've got some faith in. What gives them a lot of faith is if there's international sales and it's still within the affordable range. But of course, there are examples where unless that product is heavily subsidized or basically subsidized to the point it's offered free by a government, there might be a very poor uptake by the very poorest. And that was discovered, for example, in the case of impregnated bed nets in Kenya, where the belief was you should make people pay for their bed nets because they would then attach value to it. The reality is, until they made them free, they didn't get a really energetic take-up. They had to put aside the rhetoric and do the research to find out what can we do to stimulate good uptake. And if you look at this very simple graphic of healthcare in India, what I want you just to notice is how big the orange bars are. 70% of healthcare in India is accessed through private sector. So there's no point in believing that governments are going to solve everything when they currently are dealing with 15–30% of a healthcare need in a country like India with a huge population, huge demands on its public budgets. Private healthcare has an important role to play. And if that's the case, what you want are affordable medicines coming out of that sector, which are of good quality. Now, I heard it said more times than enough, this phrase from company executives, You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And what they're saying is they seem to get it in the neck, whether they contribute to global health or if they stand back from global health. But one way and another, they get criticized. If you look at the whole quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, it says something really important. Do what you feel in your heart to be right. You'll be criticized anyway. So what they say, what she was saying here is, maybe you are damned if you do, damned if you don't. But actually, if you lead a humanitarian and ethical path, you probably are doing the best you can. And I think that's a really important message. And I like to see the full quote, frankly. And I'm going to sort of give you an example based on Ebola. I'm coming towards the end now. So I'll give you an example based on Ebola vaccine. So this is the crash program that preceded COVID vaccines, if you like. I mean, it's crash in the same sense. There was a lot of research, in effect, had been done before they did the accelerated program in 2014. But Merck and Janssen, working sort of within Johnson & Johnson, GlaxoSmithKline, they all had highly accelerated programs when the outbreak in West Africa happened. There was great anxiety about what was happening in West African cities. There was a real sense of urgency. Merck licensed in a vaccine from a small biotech called Newlink, which was a Canadian biotech company. It was actually an oncology company, wasn't doing much with this vaccine. They in turn had obtained this from a Canadian public laboratory, and that Canadian public laboratory had in turn obtained some of the technology from Germany. So, you know, there's clearly a path in there. Janssen & Janssen were working with the AD26, the same vector that they've used for COVID, and MVA, that's modified vaccinia Ankara, in a combined, in a prime boost model. And GlaxoSmithKline were using an adenovirus, not from humans like AD26, but from chimpanzees called Chadad3. Two of those became registered. The Merck vaccine in 2019, and in 2020, 2021, there was approval of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And one of them, the GSK product, has been transferred to the Sabin Institute and for further development. What I want you to notice is what I'm doing with a sort of star rating on the right-hand column. You get a lot of public recognition as a company if you engage in an effort like this. So all three of those companies got a lot of publicity at the time that they were actively engaging with the crisis that was Ebola in West Africa. And it was a huge headline crisis. If you get your product registered, you might be lucky and still get quite a bit of public recognition because, of course, now it's a major triumph to get a registered product. If you don't get a registered product, you basically disappear. There's no runner-up prize. You basically get nothing in return for the amount of effort that I'm sure GSK and their collaborators put into that. But in terms of ongoing liability, my goodness, if you get a registered product, and if that product is later on deployed over time, you get less and less notice from the public as it becomes a sort of working tool, if you like. But these companies have to be able to manufacture at speed when there's a new crisis and in volume when that crisis is a large one. And they are going to be heavily criticized if they cannot match those objectives of speed, quality, and turning on and off the tap, basically at will. And I do know a lot of people in those companies on the manufacturing side that tell me what a huge commitment that is for these companies. They can't just mothball a manufacturing plant on the expectation that one of these days they might get a phone call from WHO. They have to provide a mechanism to be extremely flexible in their manufacturing. And that's an expensive business for a vaccine for which they can't really expect, nor do they want to be seen to take a heavy return. So I'm going to end on this. I call it the sonic boom effect. So in aircraft, when there's a sonic boom, the pilot doesn't hear it. Just like the researcher who cuts a deal with an industry partner. At the time you cut the deal, you don't know if it's going to be a success or not. You don't know if it's going to be a global vaccine or not. All you know is you've engaged that company, they've made a certain level of commitment, and everyone sitting there in the cockpit doesn't really know what's coming next. What's happening behind the aircraft is it could be a sonic boom, either a huge embarrassment, a terrible problem in terms of a toxicity or another issue that comes up, or a massive success. You simply don't know what's going to emerge. You'll do your best that what emerges at the back end is good, but something's going to emerge. And in an aircraft, what you get on the ground is what's called a noise zone carpet, an area over which the sonic boom can be heard. And thus it is with the industry. People in the industry know when a company has had a bad experience working with a partner in global health. They know when they've had a good experience, and they know all the examples in between. The grapevine works very well. So there's a huge responsibility when you work with a company to work with them in good spirits, because if you mess them around, if they're screwed about, if they gain a bad reputation from having engaged on the problem, not only they, but others will learn about it. It's the sonic boom carpet, if you like. So physicists like to have laws, and I used to get fed up with listening to physicists' laws when biologists we were told they only have opinions. So I produced a few laws of my own as a biologist. So here they are, my laws for industry engagement. The first one is, this is about people, not institutions. When in my dealings with companies, what you find is the interpersonal relationships hugely matter. Did the CEO engage with people from a perspective that they understand the global health implications? Do they have a personal history of knowing what a disease is like? Those things can be key to success. Don't don't speed out. Make this a process in which you get to know each other and arrive on the same wavelength. And start well rather than start big. It's much better to have a healthy working relationship, even if the size of the ambition is not as large as you would like, and then grow it out. So I end on that. Manus multi cor unum. Many hands, one heart. So you'll need a big group of people to engage any serious challenge in global health. But you're so much better off if there is one thing at the heart of that, one objective, one ambition that is shared amongst those many hands. And I'll conclude there.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ted, for that presentation. I think I'll hand over to Tunde to moderate with questions if we have from the audience. Tunde, can you please?
Yes, please. So we want to appreciate every single member who has taken the time to listen to Ted's talk. I'm sure you've all picked up various points. It's been a very rich and broad talk. So please, if you have any question you would like to ask Ted, he is going to be with us for the next 20 minutes. Kindly just raise your hand by the emoji, and then we will call out your name so that you can unmute and ask your question. Any questions, please? So maybe I will set the ball rolling, if that's okay. Mine is about okay, let me defer to, we have one question from, forgive me if I don't pronounce your name properly, I'm terrible with names. Helen Marie.
Don't worry, it's Helena, I'll help you.
Oh, thank you so much, Helena. Go ahead with your question.
Ted, thank you for the really interesting presentation. It's fantastic to have your kind of experience on a talk. And I must confess, I come from a civil society background, so I'm deeply suspicious of the pharmaceutical industry's motives. But I think you put together sort of a really good argument for how they can be valuable partners. I found myself sort of nodding along, and then the moment I looked back and I remembered what was the kind of like, I almost started feeling really sorry for the poor pharmaceutical companies that can't make a profit with their technologies. But then I just had a quick Google to see what the Johnson & Johnson CEO earned in 2020, and he got like $29.6 million, making sort of a massive profit during a pandemic where vaccine access has been, I don't know how to call it other than a global disaster. So I would like to firstly hear what your thoughts are on the TRIPS waiver for intellectual property related to the specific pandemic. But secondly, how we find a balance between these enormous profits that are really taking priority over actually getting life-saving technologies to people, but also stimulating the kind of innovation that we need to solve really big global health problems.
Yes, thank you. It's great that you asked that series of questions and made those observations, because I think you've covered topics which a lot of people have in their mind when they hear about the industry and global health. I would say that the CEO's salary is irrelevant. The reason I say that is because you wouldn't raise the same argument for Bill Gates' salary from Microsoft, because he gives away most of the money that he made as an individual. And I don't stand ready to really try and stack people's morality based on their salary. I think you're wrong, I have to say, about the COVID vaccine from Johnson & Johnson and their sort of profit motive. Sadly, Johnson & Johnson find themselves in a position that they're not one of the recommended COVID vaccines in the US, where they were placing a lot of store in having a market in terms of getting a return on their investment. And they have sold very little vaccine in comparison with the two leaders in RNA vaccines. And they have smaller sales, of course, than AstraZeneca too. So they haven't done well out of this reputationally. They haven't done particularly well out of it in terms of a return on investment. It's a gamble always when a pharmaceutical company makes a contribution to any initiative where there are a lot of players. And so I wouldn't personally see as an objection whether J&J make money on that vaccine or not. Paul Stoffels, who is their chief scientist, is somebody I know well. And Paul Stoffels is a man of huge integrity who spent a large part of his career battling HIV in Africa. In fact, he and Peter Pearce, who you might know from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, are thick as thieves, because I think actually Paul Stoffels was one of Peter's PhD students at one time. I think they certainly worked together. So Paul Stoffels has got a very, very strongly developed sense of integrity, of concern for communities that are suffering, in particular from some of the viral diseases like HIV, which is his professional background. I don't know that the TRIPS agreement as a mechanism, or shall I say compulsory licensing, as a mechanism to make available COVID vaccines would be a particularly good route to pursue. The reason I say this is because, unlike drugs where you have a formula, a piece of chemistry, you have a chemical formula, you have analytic assays that can determine how much of that product, how much of that compound is present, how much of other compounds are present. It's a pretty precise kind of thing to address. So you know exactly what you want to make, and you know exactly what should not be there. With vaccines, and all biologics, it's much, much more difficult. There is so much that is not really to do with the patents, but to do with the process. And I just am quite sure if you speak to anyone in vaccine manufacture, they will tell you that the amount of skill in transferring the technology from one company to another is as high a bar to cross as you'll find anywhere in medicine. It's extremely demanding. And that's because every batch of a biological medicine has to be verified through analytics. And there's a large amount of wastage if you do the job properly. So I think if you were to transfer a vaccine to, let's say you wanted to transfer one of the vaccines to Africa, the first problem you would have is finding a credible manufacturer to take it on. The second you'd have is an extensive piece of technology transfer. And the third is, in most instances, you have to take it on piecemeal. Like the first stage of transferring a vaccine is called fill and finish. It's just taking the bulk product and distributing it into the vials to create the correct dosage in the correct format with the correct storage and shelf life features. It would probably take over a decade from where we are today to get a vaccine manufacturer into the kind of shape to produce at high volume a COVID vaccine from a cold start. So I think that what's much more important is the encouragement of companies to work in a manner which is responsible and ethical in the middle of a pandemic. And that is, I think, in the manner, quite frankly, that AstraZeneca chose to work with Oxford, which is they say, we'll make some money from this vaccine when the pandemic's over and it becomes a sort of normalized medicine, if you like. But while there is a pandemic, we will provide this at no profit, no cost, no profit, no loss basis to the world. And I think that's commendable. And I think that was a really good judgment call on the part of that collaboration between the university and the company. Your nervousness about pharmaceutical companies, I fully understand. Pharma companies have misbehaved in the past over lots of things, as we're well aware. And those misbehaviors always hit the headlines. Do you know how many years Merck has been distributing HPV vaccine, that they've been distributing Mectizan for OGHCS control, that they've been distributing at low prices, rotavirus vaccine? You're probably much less aware because it's become a routine matter. But these routine, once they become routine matters, in a way, you start getting the huge benefit of having had a compliant engagement with the industry. I'm giving the example of Merck, but actually GSK has also been extremely good in terms of making available at low prices some of the most important vaccines developed in recent years. So I'm not trying, I wouldn't whitewash the industry. The industry's got lots to answer for. Different companies have different traditions of engagement with global health, but some of them, their traditions are pretty good, and they have to, of course, satisfy their shareholders that the amount that they take on is a reasonable level of risk, a reasonable loss to profitability, if you like. And where they carry their shareholders with them, I think they probably are doing the best they can.
Right, thank you very much. There are two questions in the chat box. Scott wants to know whether you think the world needs a new body to coordinate disease surveillance and efforts by the pharmaceutical industry. So I guess it's talking about coordinating unmet medical needs and then efforts to develop new medicines for those. He thinks the WHO is proving a bit weak. That's question one. And Chidima wants to know what you think the industry can do to make medicines for non-communicable diseases cheaper in lower middle income countries. Thank you.
Yes, so let me just make a note of that. Yeah, so in relation to coordination, it's a mandate. There's an existing mandate to the World Health Organization to understand essentially the health of the globe, what's happening when, to make declaration formally to declare epidemics or pandemics, and so on and so forth. I think that existing body can't be supplanted by something that purports to bring together the industry. So what we're talking about is what could engage with WHO when WHO declares, for example, a health emergency of some description. How can the industry respond to that in a collective way? My take is that it's asking a lot to expect a collective response from the industry. What you get is, if you have a good communication with the industry, what you can expect to get is a range of responses from companies, because all companies are in different states of financial, they're either in a state of good health, in a state of dire financial grief. It varies. When their main drugs fall off the patent cliff, they can lose a lot of profitability. When they have a new drug, a new blockbuster, they can make a lot of money. It just varies. So you have different companies with different conditions at different times. And I don't think you can expect a sort of generic response from them. You'll get different kinds of responses. The PDPs have been one mechanism to pull in companies when there is some kind of emergency. But if you wanted a reaction to something like a pandemic, as we had with COVID, I think actually the size of the response was so enormous, I'm not sure you'd want to do anything to make it larger still. There were well in excess of 200 R&D programs to make a COVID vaccine at one point, and it was never going to be sensible to try and push 200 products through. There needed to be very big fallout of the less likely vaccines, and you might have heard of some of them. So a number of companies dropped their vaccine programs because they simply didn't look as productive as the highly successful outcomes from the first crop of companies to announce results. So I wouldn't particularly encourage large responses to particular emergencies, because I think that happens. I think what's more difficult are for those things that we've lived with for a long time and simply have lost their sort of profile because they've been with us so long, like TB. So it's extremely difficult to get a lot of energy into TB R&D, for TB vaccine R&D. And yet this is an enormous problem, hasn't gone away. It's a difficult problem, and I think people are aware that it's a difficult problem. There has been a bit of success with TB vaccines in recent past, but there's not a commensurate level of engagement with developing a TB vaccine as there is a need. So I think that's these conditions that the world has learned to live with, and shouldn't have to learn to live with, that I would like to see given more profile rather than the emergencies. In terms of the conversation about non-communicable disease and affordable medicines, certainly it's been there's been a huge contribution made by high volume, low cost manufacturers of drugs that come off patent. But if you have new chemical entities that are entering the market within patent life, it's extremely difficult to simply conjure up a workaround for those patent protections. So the best approach is if companies can be encouraged to want to market their drugs at tiered prices in middle and low income countries. At one point, Wellcome tried to fund a group to address the question: could they come up with a generic formula for how to tier the price for some of these middle income countries? Because as I said earlier, middle income countries, small middle income countries, can't negotiate, on a bilateral basis with pharmaceutical companies very well. They need to form sort of purchasing groups and get some power behind that. And it would help the companies if there were some sort of template agreements, if you like, from which they could modify the kind of arrangement they might wish to work to with any particular purchasing group. But this is beset with a very large number of complexities, which aren't just about medicine and health, but are to do with geopolitics, all sorts of things. So I don't think that's a trivial problem to address. I think one of the things we tried to do in India at Wellcome was encourage a local R&D effort. That is to say, we had at one point a scheme called Affordable Healthcare, which was an Indian-specific scheme, and it was designed to get companies who had been used to working with generics to create R&D, stronger, more vigorous, more adventurous R&D platforms, so that they could develop new chemical entities with their own patent position and work to their usual business model of high volume, low margin, low cost products. I hope Africa will follow suit and work to that same agenda. High volume, low margin, more affordability in general medicine.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. I don't know if anybody else has a question.
Tunde, I think you can question.
You said?
I think you can ask your question.
Ted, I wanted to ask, this problem of antimicrobial resistance, the fact that we have it means that, or we know that, I mean, antibiotics are widely used in human health, in animal health and everything. And it's a problem which is approaching a dangerous place. So what is the solution that governments and the industry can work out? Because if we don't act and find a solution or some new generation of antibiotics, it won't end well. So how do you think governments, policymakers, and the industry can come together and find a way for new molecules that can help us out of this thing?
I think we've probably reached a point when there's recognition that this has to be taken outside of a profit-driven industry basket. It's not easy for companies to see that they can get a return on investment, let alone make a profit from antibiotics. So this might have to be approached more as you saw COVID vaccines being approached in this country, where the government put in a large amount of money, funded relatively tight number of groups. If you imagine that on a wider scale, so I'm not talking about doing this on the scale of Britain, but doing this on an international scale, if there was a sizable pot of money for players to come in and work on their plans or licensing the technologies that they used, that they wish to use, rather like, so Merck licensed in something from a small biotech as a starting point for their VSV Ebola vaccine. And similarly, GSK was working with Chad Ad3, which was a chimpanzee adenovirus that came from another company called Acaris, which they'd acquired. So this sort of acquisition of resources that could be starting points for antibiotic development is probably quite a rich scene that could be encouraged by there being a reasonable pot of money to fund a public effort that will subsequently lead to a more open source piece of drug discovery and development. I think it has to be considered as a pretty exceptional approach, because if you said, why not do that for all medicines? I think what one would find is the public purse would not stretch to it. But the amounts of money we're talking about needing to spend on antibiotic development would be dwarfed by what we've spent on COVID. I mean, just knocked out of the park. A tiny fraction of COVID budgets worldwide would be needed to fund a real renaissance in antibiotic development. And I think we've reached a point where that kind of effort is needed. You've probably heard of CEPI and CEPI's work in terms of developing vaccines to prepare for the next emerging or re-emerging infection. So maybe what we're talking about here is a sort of CEPI equivalent for antibiotic development.
Yeah, thank you very much for answering our questions. I'll hand over to the president of the association, Francis, to conclude affairs. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Ted, for getting our time out of your busy schedule. It's been weeks we have been trying to get this event to happen, and we're excited that finally we're able to get you to speak to members of the Oxford Global Health and Care System Society today. I think my main take home from today's discussion was what you called your Bianco's Law of Industry Engagement, which clearly are very valid guides for anyone who wants to go into the pharma industry and get it right. And your first law, it's about people, not institutions. Second law, court and don't speed date. And the last law, start well rather than start big. I think that summarized the right approach to go into pharma. And clearly it's a very profitable venture, but if only profit is the motive, then global health will not fully benefit from what the pharma industry can contribute. So on behalf of the executive committee of the Oxford Global Health and Care System Society and all the members, we really appreciate you for your time. We'll keep in touch. I'm sure some other members would have had questions. I've got some private messages here that they wish there was more time, but we know you mentioned that you had a 7 o'clock or thereabout engagement. So we'll permit us to allow anyone who was at this webinar to reach you personally if they, I believe that'll be fine. And then probably for further questions or engagement as the case may be. So I think if there are no other comments, we'll get final closing remarks from Ted and then we'll close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the good-natured questions. I thought they were all very relevant. And I always understand why people have nervousness or skepticism about any profit-driven industry, of which health is just one of many. So what I think would be great is if anything I have said will help lower the barriers and allow at least the conversations to take place. Because what I found is it is about people. When people talk to each other about the issues of the day that concern them, usually the level of mutual understanding causes good things to happen. And I think good things can happen when people approach things with an open heart, trying to understand the other perspective. So let me thank the Society. Let me thank you, Francis, for your kind words. And if anyone does want to contact me, if you provide them with my contact details, I'll be very happy to respond. I've enjoyed talking with you. I wish it could have been in person, but thank you very much for the invitation.
All right, thank you very much. So I think this event was recorded and luckily we had a very vibrant audience. Even Scott from London School of Hygiene joined us, so we appreciate that. So we had some guests of the society or friends of the society also tune in. So we appreciate all those who came. And I think at this juncture, we'll say thank you to everyone. And final words from Tunde, then we'll end the meeting.
No, just to say thank you very much, and to both the audience and to our speaker for giving us a new perspective on an often maligned industry. We will take the teachings forward. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, so bye everyone.
Bye-bye now. Thank you.